Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us on Nief-Norf's one-to-one collaboration premiere night. My name's Andy Bliss. I'm the artistic director of Nief-Norf. I'm joined by my longtime friend here, Christopher Adler, our composition director. Hey Chris, thanks for being here tonight.
Hi, Andy. Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, so tonight we have the culmination of what's now been, I guess, a year's worth of work, right, Chris? We've been putting together, of course, our concert that we're going to share with you tonight. So back in March of 2020, everybody knows, a year ago now, everyone had to pivot in the music world, and we were planning our 10th anniversary summer festival. Many of you joined us in July. Well, actually, in the spring for our virtual North Space concerts that we did online, and then, of course, our 10-hour marathon that we ended up putting together back in July of 2020. But we had also accepted our fellows, both in composition and performance, to come in person in June of 2020. And when the festival had to move online, we reached out to some of the composers and said, "Hey, would you like to design a new program, or you get to maybe collaborate with us as Nief-Norf artists and our creative team?" And that lands us here tonight with the premiere of our one-to-one collaboration participants. So, Chris, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how these collaborations came about, and of course, we always appreciate all the hard work you put in as the composition director and everything that you do for the organization. And maybe you could tell everybody at home a little bit about what they might expect.
Well, so for each of the 5 composers who joined this program, we gave them a choice of the performance faculty of Nief-Norf, who they'd like to work with, what instrument they'd like to play, and who they'd like to work with. They each chose their performer, and then they had an opportunity to receive mentorship from me as they worked on their composition, and then work closely with the performer through one or more Zoom meetings, going over the instrument, trying out drafts. So we tried to emulate the collaborative model of the festival, but online and over a much longer period of time. And so each of the composers then produced their final score, and each of the performance faculty recorded that on their own in a video performance that you'll be watching tonight. In advance of each one of those performances, we'll also be joined with an on-screen interview with each of the composers, where we ask them about their piece and about the process of collaboration.
Yeah, so I want to make sure again that I thank Chris for his help pulling this together, to our team behind the scenes, and especially to Allison Adams, Willie, Ashley Walters, and Lisa Cella for the collaboration as the performers that you're going to hear on tonight's concert. So I'd also like to remind everybody at home that we're still fighting our way through the pandemic as a nonprofit, and we would very, very much appreciate your financial support tonight. We've been working hard to continue to deliver contemporary music related content to our community and to our audience during these times, and we are really excited to chat with you in the YouTube chat tonight, and would really appreciate your support through a financial donation. So please consider giving to the Nief-Norf organization so that we can continue not only our performance activities as an ensemble and as an organization, but these educational and service related activities working with other composers and performers, which we very, very much have been enjoying doing for a very long time. So thank you so much for being here. We're so excited about these 5 digital premieres tonight that we get to experience together, and had a wonderful time chatting with everybody, and we're excited for you to hear those conversations as well. So thank you for your support, and we hope you enjoy the show. Take care.
Now we're joined by the composer of Currently, Alex Shainefelt. He wrote the piece for percussionist Willie. Welcome, Alex.
Hi, it's good to be here.
I'd like to start off by asking you about writing for percussion. Can you tell us if you've written for percussion before, and what you learned from the process of working with Eric?
Yeah, sure. So I've never written a piece for percussion solo. If I have written for percussion, it's been for a larger ensemble. So when I got the news I was accepted to Nief-Norf, I was really excited to sort of meet that challenge head on. So Willie was such a great mentor in helping me figure out how to write for the ensemble and sort of approach it compositionally and from a performer's point of view too. So I really feel like that was really fulfilling for me to be as a part of the festival.
Yeah, so Alex, you said you're based in Indianapolis, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry that we didn't get to hang out this summer, of course, but was really excited, of course, as a percussionist myself, to see that you were writing for percussion. And we've done lots of big percussion projects at the festival over the years,
Sure.
dating back 10 years now. So can you talk maybe a little bit about some of the instruments that we might hear that ended up making it into your piece, and kind of how the process went for selecting those items?
Sure. The concept for the piece sort of evolved over time, but what I ended up doing was separating the multi-percussion setup into three different groups. One of them being the toms and snare drums, so those membrane instruments. One of them being the unpitched metallics, and then one of them being the crotales and cymbals. And in writing the piece, I separated these instruments in their role in the music. So the toms and the snare and the unpitched metallics were improvised upon, while the crotales and cymbals were all strictly notated for the performer.
And Alex, there's an electronic component to your piece as well. So can you explain to us what role that plays in the composition?
Sure. So as part of currently, there's some improvisation going on, and I wanted to contrast that with the fixed element of the media. While the percussionist's performance could change every time, the electronics won't. So in that regard, that's sort of their role in the piece. I also constructed them to sort of be ambiguous or very clear at times. So while Eric is improvising, it's either he can pull anything from the electronics, or there's a very definite gesture that he's sort of reacting to.
Awesome. Well, any big aha moments in your first jump into percussion, or big takeaways that you had, particular
Sure.
favorite things that you discovered, or stuff from the process?
Well, I really enjoy working with all the different timbres that the instruments offered. From a bigger picture, working, sort of figuring out how to balance the electronics with the live performer was tricky, but I think I found a good balance at the end. And seeing Eric perform it just in itself sort of provided me a lot of really valuable insight in writing for percussion.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Alex. Now let's listen to Eric Willie performing Currently by Alex Shainefelt.
Thanks, Alex.
We're now joined by Huijuan Ling, the composer of the piece The Below is as the Above and the Above as the Below, written for Nief-Norf cellist Ashley Walters. Huijuan joins us from Durham, North Carolina, and we first got to know her at the 2019 Nief-Norf Summer Festival.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great to have you. Thanks for being with us. Maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about kind of the title. I really enjoyed reading through the program note, which of course we're not going to be able to see on the live stream, but maybe you could talk a little bit about, how you came about the title of the piece and some of the inspiration for the work.
Thank you so much for having me. The title was coming from a book I was reading for fun back in summer. The book is about alchemy, actually. So when I was reading that book, there are some principles of alchemy. The idea is basically that something sort of like transforms into something else. So in a way that it reverses into a different thing, but it's still the same thing. So it's the idea of the circle. While having the idea of circle in my mind, I just randomly picked up one sentence. It says the below is as the above and the above as the below. So at that moment, I felt it's so cyclic. I really liked it. And then that's why I picked it as my title.
Well, so can you tell us a bit about how this notion of cycles plays out in how you put the composition together?
Sure. So myself, I'm a keyboardist. So every time when I think about a piece of music, I start thinking about chords or harmonies. So right now I'm gonna share with you desktop. So over here, it was actually the pre-composition material for me. At that time, I was thinking about, I just did a map because with the scorciatura, the entire piece, I don't want it to be just a cycle. I want it to be a cycle, but also with a linear direction. So it goes from sort of like the high register for the cello to the low register. Then it goes 7 chords forward, then 4 chords backwards, 7 more chords forward, 3 backwards, then 7, 4, 7, 3, so on and so forth. Then I picked my initial melodic material from the first 2 grid over here, then into this. Then that's basically my starting point. Then initially I was thinking this melodic line would just be sort of like my bare bone framework material, but then eventually I actually put in the piece because why not? I kind of like it.
So you mentioned in there that you did some scorciatura. Can you tell us what that is and what, how did your performer react to that also?
I mean, because it's Ashley, she can basically do everything. So, and as soon as I know I will have the chance to collaborate with Ashley, I was so thrilled. Then immediately I shoot an email to her, says, can we talk about scorciatura? Then the next day I said initially I gave her 4 options. Then do I have them? No. So 4 options, then basically it turns out then we picked one that we really liked. And with scorciatura, then it's a new thing for me to learn that it's always easier to down tuning a string instead of like tuning one string up. Then in my specific scorciatura, my A string was tuned down for 5.5 half steps. So it landed on E quarter flat because in that sense, E quarter flat and D is really close to each other. And because the E quarter flat string is a lot looser, so it feels like the echoing string of the D string. So it's more like shadowing effect. I think it will be really cool. Then amazingly, I'm not really sure whether this will work on some other cello or not because it's down tuned so much. But then amazingly, it works on Ashley's cello. So I guess the scorciatura is also special for Ashley too, in a way. I hope she feels that way too. At least I feel that way.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like, as a percussionist, I think about that a lot and how like no one instrument is the same. A gong is all different sizes, or a concert tom or something. So it's kind of cool to hear some of those parallels on a different instrument and a set of strings, and that was cool. Can you talk a little bit? I got the privilege of the sneak peek of the recording, and I really was enamored by this idea of these glissandi that come in throughout the piece and the gesture involved in that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that mapped into the piece in addition to everything that you've already covered, with the composition.
Right. The piece itself for me is kind of gestural. Then the one thing I consider as always coming back is a timbre trill. It's a harmonic trill that showed up in, I believe, rehearsal mark A. Then going from there, because the idea is piece it goes wider and wider, then I think for me it's more just like naturally the glissando as a extension of the timbre trill, because timbre trill is just I consider that as very small bliss, if that makes sense. It gets wider and wider and wider. That's yeah. It's basically sort of like extension of the one gesture, and in the meantime, it comes back to itself in the piece.
Very cool. That makes a lot of sense to me. I've never thought about the idea of a trill as a gliss, but that's a cool concept.
Was there any surprises in working with Ashley and the back and forth in the process of creating this piece?
I was really hoping the entire time if we're doing that in person, it will be so much, it will be like, I don't know, I feel like I will have a chance to know her better, because one thing I really like about Nief-Norf is the entire 2 weeks in the summer festival is not only 2 weeks, only 2 weeks of we rehearsed together, we played together. It's also about 2 weeks of us hanging out together all the time after the rehearsal, after the concert. I still vividly remember back in 2019, the piece I wrote for Nief-Norf, I also had the cello in it, but then at that time my cello part was really high. I actually didn't really say anything until after the premiere concert, we were out drinking and played bowling. Then finally, after 2 beers, she was like, "Are you sure you don't want a violin?"
Yeah.
At that time, I was like, okay, so after 2 weeks, we're that comfortable with each other, so confident that we will not be offended by such comments, then so we can talk about this now, you know?
Yeah, I definitely missed that aspect of the community for sure, and was just this last week reminiscing about, boy, I wish we could just go out and hit Maple City and do some bowling and hang out, and I definitely look forward to the times in the future when Nief-Norf can do that together again. So it's great to hear that insight from you.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Huijuan. Now let's listen to Ashley Walters performing "The Below is as the Above and the Above as the Below" by Huijuan Ling. I'm joined by Azariah Felton from Perth in Western Australia. He composed the piece Breathe for Nief-Norf flutist Lisa Cella. Welcome, Azariah.
Thanks. It's great to virtually be here.
We're glad we could have you at least this way. I'd like to start off by asking you about your selection of instruments, because when you write for Lisa, of course, she's got quite a few different flutes to pick from. So why did you select the bass flute?
I've really loved the bass flute for quite a while. I find it just has such a very rich and detailed texture. And I think partly going into that as well, you get a lot less opportunities to write for bass flute than you do for some of the other members of the flute family. So I sort of jumped at the chance.
Did she give you any special tips about writing for bass flute in particular?
Stamina's a big thing. You're kind of holding a big metal pipe out to the side of you at shoulder height. It uses a whole lot of breath. That was a big part of it. I think we didn't really need to worry about the volume because it was a solo piece and it's recorded and all of that. So that was nice not to have that limitation that can also often be a thing, but we talked about that as well.
Well, and so the piece really highlights breath and breathing. But the focus of your score, in a way, when we look at it, it has a very unusual appearance and it's focused on texture. So can you talk about how you use texture and place the musical focus on texture with your score?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been sort of exploring texture in a range of contexts for a while now. It sort of shows up a lot in my electronic pieces as well. I think particularly here, so my first sort of Zoom meeting with Lisa was just her taking me through this huge catalog of extended techniques and spectacular sounds that she could make with the instrument. And then once I'd sort of lived in that world for a little bit, I went and just started creating these visual textures in Photoshop, which I brought back to her and sort of asked what those textures suggested to her musically and sonically. And we kind of worked from that point, finding which visual textures brought out which sonic textures and then arranging them to create the piece.
One of the things that struck me as especially interesting about the piece, like you said, it is about breathing, but because it's about texture, in a way, the textures then become this kind of modulation of breath. And we become very attentive to the idea of breath being labored or interrupted or impeded or flowing. I'm curious how you were dealing with the notion of breath as a musical parameter.
So quite early on, I decided that I wanted, rather than having exhales to be carrying all the musical material and inhales to just be these sort of things that happened in between the music as unobtrusively as possible. I wanted to sort of have, this unending flow of music that used both the exhales and the inhales. But a lot of sounds that we can make, particularly on a flute while inhaling, are more difficult to accomplish. And so they do tend to start to sound a little bit more labored and stuff like that. But Lisa and I spoke about the different things she could do while inhaling and playing. And it was really quite a vast amount of different options that we had, even for both breath options. But I liked that it was this continuous change in texture that the breathing contributed to, as opposed to kind of lots of little interruptions to get more breath in, kind of thing.
With that, let us listen to Lisa Cella performing Breathe by Azariah Felton. Now we're joined by Jimmy Levy, composer of The Alibi, written for Allison Adams, playing on tenor saxophone. And he is joining us from St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota.
Yeah, welcome, Jimmy. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe you could start by just telling us a little bit about where the title of the piece came from. And, you know, there's an interesting program note that, of course, the folks on the live concert won't be able to read, but I really enjoyed reading through those. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about, kind of your inspiration for the piece with Allison.
Yeah, so growing up, my parents watched a lot of detective TV shows, especially Monk and Columbo. And in those shows, there's always a moment where the bad guy is like, they've been constructing their alibi throughout the entire episode, and the detective's onto them, and they are about to reveal like the big piece of evidence that gets them caught. And they're just starting to their story is starting to fall apart under the weight of its own lies. And so I wanted to write a piece where formally that falling apart kind of happens on stage and throughout the musical material.
So in working with Allison, were there things that you learned about the saxophone or what she could do about the saxophone that you really wanted to incorporate into this piece?
Yeah, so early in the process, I was working with Allison, just like learning what was possible. And I had written for some saxophone before, but there were lots of techniques like multiphonics, which I hadn't explored. And I also learned that the saxophone was capable of quarter tones, which I did not know. And so that ended up becoming a central part of my musical language. And so it was really helpful just like really early on there, just like, okay, here's a resource where I can see a bunch of saxophone multiphonics listed and I can listen to them. And here's what's possible. And what is the musical language that I have available to me.
And that the multiphonics play a role in this idea of the unfolding story. Is that right?
Yeah, so the general pitch material of the piece starts out very focused and within a very small register, and then as it kind of unravels, it expands until it's way in the extremes. And one of the multiphonics that I end up using, depending on how much you blow into the instrument, it either is kind of just this like kind of slightly off fifth in the middle of the register, or it's just this like huge timbre that just kind of spans the register. And so I start the piece with the tighter version, and then at the very end it kind of gets uncovered.
Great.
Maybe you could. That's interesting. Maybe you could talk a little bit about. I'd be kind of curious to know, I guess, how the piece unfolded through a digital collaboration and like the life cycle of collaborating in the year 2020. Of course, we were really excited to work with you in person at the summer festival, and you'd been accepted to the program, and we had all these great plans, and we ended up making this new plan that is what we're kind of here to celebrate with this concert. And I'm curious what the collaborative life cycle looked like, and maybe some of the things that you found interesting or learned from or took away from the process with this piece.
My sketching process took a very long time compared to, I think, if I'm working with in-person performers, it's much faster for me. Like last year, I wrote a pretty similar scoped project in the course of like a week, and this one took me months. And I think some of that is just not really having access to the in-person resources, but also being just being able to send an email and be like, hey, does this multiphonic work on your instrument? And then getting a response the next day and being able to adjust how I'm writing the piece through that was really helpful. And so it worked well for me. It just kind of looked a little different.
Great. Well, Jimmy, thank you very much for joining us. Now let's listen to Allison Adams performing The Alibi by Jimmy Levy.
Thanks so much, Jimmy.
Thank you.
Now we're joined by the composer of the piece Sanguine, Lawton Hall, who is joining us from Milwaukee. His piece is performed by Nief-Norf cellist Ashley Walters. Welcome, Lawton.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start off by asking you about this piece. I noticed in the score, you use what we call just intonation, up a number of different systems of high harmonics on the different strings, 5, 7, and 11 limit just intonation. Can you say a little bit about what draws you to that sound world and what previous experience you have with it?
Yeah, so just intonation, if you think about the notes that we have on a piano, that's really kind of a compromise. The fact that we just have 12 notes in the piano. They're very close, but not exactly what you would hear like in the natural harmonic series, the notes that you get when you have like the overtones of cello harmonics or the overtones of a brass instrument. And so when in a lot of famous cello music, like the Bach cello suites, even though all those markings about what harmonics exactly to play aren't in the score, most cellists will make those tuning adjustments to get the tuning really pure, and it's very distinctive to the sound of unaccompanied cello music. And this is something that Ashley and I spoke about really early on, is that like, even if you don't realize it, good cellists are playing music that way. So it seemed natural to use these natural harmonics in an unaccompanied cello solo. And I've had an interest in just intonation for a long time. I was fortunate when I was in college to study informally with the composer Ben Johnston, who was a pioneer of just intonation, and learned a lot from him. But in practice, it's difficult to pull off, and it takes a performer like Ashley Walters to really hit all these precise tunings just right.
That's super interesting. Thanks. Can you maybe talk a little bit about, speaking of Ashley, like what the process was like for you? Obviously this year's been really different, and we're putting together all this music digitally and online, but I'm kind of curious like what the workflow is like. And I'm always so inspired by composers. Like the idea of writing for all these instruments is so intimidating to me. Like I have enough to going with just percussion, and the fact that you guys are able to like intuitively understand the inner workings of all these different instruments is just inspiring to me. But I'm kind of curious like what that workflow was like and how the piece came about, and working together.
Yeah, I think Ashley and I had a meeting before I ever wrote a note of this, and just kind of talked about trying to feel out what our common interests are. Ashley has done a lot of work with just intonation. So when we had those conversations about playing Bach, it happened before I'd ever written anything. And then I wrote the piece, basically. She also gave me guidance about the notation system that she likes to use for those particular harmonics and microtonal intervals. And then after I sent her the score, she spent several weeks with it, and then we had about 3 or 4 Zoom meetings where they were long Zoom meetings, like an hour at a time, and that time was really essential because there's so much kinesthetically about playing the cello. Can you reach this? Can you grab this? What's the bowing going to be like? I mean, it's a very, very physical instrument. And when I was writing it, I'm not a cellist. I tried to plan for all those things, but there are just so many little micro movements and how do you shift from one place to another that I wasn't able to anticipate. And so a lot of the time that we spent in our rehearsals together was just Ashley giving me advice about how to pull off these things. And sometimes things weren't playable, but she would come with some solutions, and I would try to describe to her what I was going for, and then she would offer some solutions about how to do it. We would make decisions like that. So the piece definitely evolved and changed from when I wrote it and sent her a score, for sure. It was a great collaboration. And just having that much time made it possible for me to write something like this, because I wanted it to be very much a cello piece and show what cello is capable of doing.
Wonderful. You mentioned in your earlier comment that you were talking with Ashley about Bach. And speaking of sort of writing a cello piece, I did feel like I heard little maybe fragments of Bach, sort of arpeggios that go across the strings, but also some sort of an almost like folkish melodies that become more and more transformed by the exotic tuning system into something a really remarkable, sort of unique harmonic space. Well, I'm curious, first of all, if that makes any sense, but also if that relates at all to the title of the piece.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the kind of like folksiness goes, I think we in this kind of academic music world, you think of just intonation as being this sort of avant-garde experimental thing. But if you listen, to fiddlers and a lot of folk traditions, I mean, when you're playing instruments that are able to get these microtonal intervals, it falls naturally. I mean, it's almost harder to try and play along precisely to a piano. So I think that there's this kind of intuitive folksiness, if you want to use that word, to the sound world that you can get through just intonation. And I'm really drawn to that. I really get a lot of inspiration from, all sorts of different music. But so I do think there's definitely an aspect of that. And then you asked about the title, it's called Sanguine. And I was just thinking about, the root of the word sanguine. It refers to our blood, and thinking about the, blood in our bodies, and thinking about this being like a very embodied sort of thing, and try to make it sound as intuitive as possible. Was definitely part of the thought process. And even things like the opening gesture is like an inhale sort of sound, and then it ends with like an exhale. So thinking of these taking these kind of high concept things about just intonation, then trying to ground them in something very embodied, hopefully.
I wonder if you could speak to that just a little bit more. I'm really intrigued by this idea of like the blood flowing in our bodies. And, before we hit record here, you mentioned something about, this kind of visceral, performative thing that you've been toying around with. And, perhaps you could talk a little bit about how this piece is interacting with maybe some other things that you're working on, maybe even for the future, or have been, stewing with over the course of 2020 and 2021. And I just love this idea that in this moment in time that you're kind of wrestling with this idea of, the performer kind of looking inward to the instrument.
Yeah, so not necessarily in this piece, but in a lot of my music, I'm interested in generative processes and like algorithmic composition and things like that. I'm really inspired by like the compositional potential of those things. But what I found is that if I just focus on that side of my like brain, that side of my world, it can be a little cold and kind of disembodied. So I've been really thinking, I don't know that I have any solutions yet, but just thinking about, okay, well, the next step for me, I think, is to try to meld here's a number series that does something really interesting, but what's that process of then turning that into, something that a human being is going to play with their bodies, and then people are going to hear with their bodies and experience with their bodies. And that's the kind of middle ground that that sort of interpretive dance that I'm trying to do between, I think there are really fascinating algorithmic compositional things, generative processes that produce really cool stuff that I can sit here and listen to on my computer, but I don't just want to make things that I sit and listen to on my computer.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Well, thank you very much, Lawton, for joining us. Now let's listen to Ashley Walters performing Sanguine by Lawton Hall.
Thank you.
that.